In this video, I'm going to discuss the not so uncommon occurrence of getting a brand new fountain pen and having it write poorly out of the box. I'll go over some of the reasons for this and what you can do about it coming up. So this is one of the weirdest things about fountain pens. You can buy a brand new one from a very well-respected, renowned brand, spend a couple $100s on it or more, and you get it at home, take it out of the box, ink it up, and it's skipping, it's hard starting, the flow is dry. And the frustrating thing is, this really isn't that rare. It's actually pretty common. Let's talk about the real problem here with the expectation when it comes to fountain pens. And it has to do with ballpoint pens. These are the standard. They were released, I believe, in the 1960s, and this is what everybody basically knows of now as a pen. Not these particular ones, but basically the way that it works, if we look very closely here, and it is going to be kind of a little bit hard to see, but so at the very end of this tip, there is a little tiny ball that's sitting in this little metal, funnel-shaped tip here. So when you drag the ball across the page, the ball is spinning and ink is coming out. Now, this is a traditional Parker-style roller ball, or ballpoint rather, and this uses like a viscous, oily ink. This one, I have a auto gel refill in here. It's the same thing. It has a finer point, but there's a tiny little ball at the end that rolls there. And this has a clear body to it. Now the ink normally is much closer up here, but this is a gel, and again, this is a viscous ink, and there isn't really too much in terms of a feeding system here. The viscosity of the ink is enough to keep the ink in the refill without it just spilling out onto the page. If I were to tip it down like this, the ball has to roll over the paper for the ink to come out. Now, this is a ingenious piece of design here. It is fantastic, honestly. And this has basically become the standard and has set the expectation that this is how a pen should work. It is bulletproof, pretty much. It's going to work every time. The quality can be mediocre. I mean, the writing experience can also be mediocre, but it writes. These have both very good refills in them, but this has sort of created the expectation problem that we have with fountain pen nibs. Now, going to a less reliable, but still more reliable, generally speaking, type of pen. This is a rollerball pen. This is a Pilot Precise Phi, and this has a feeding system that is much more like that of a fountain pen. This still isn't like, I don't think this is still pure water-based ink. I think it is a more viscous type of ink, but it is fed through this feed with these fins. So in a sense, this is similar to a fountain pen in that it's a little bit more of a controlled leak. It has more of that fountain pen, fluid control system. But if we look, we still have that tiny ball at the end, and so again, as you drag the pen across the page, the ball is rolling, and the ink is sort of coming down and around and then onto the page as this ball rolls, essentially. So this is creating your line there. Compared to the ballpoint and the roller ball, the fountain pen nib is a little bit more tricky. There's a lot more that can go wrong. With these, the ball is, captive in its tube there, and there's really just nowhere for it to go. The only thing that can go wrong with this is it can run out of ink, or in the case of a roller ball where it's more liquid, it can dry out. That's why a roller ball needs a cap. Ballpoint typically doesn't need a cap. A fountain pen always needs to be sealed off because it is a liquid ink. And similar to the roller ball, this is not just a metal point. This is a tiny fluid control system, and this is where I think a lot of the disappointment that we can experience when a pen is new and it's not writing perfectly out of the box. The expectations set by these other pens, which are basically the defaults now, those are much more reliable systems. However, once one of these is properly tuned and working correctly, there's much more reward to be had from using a fountain pen. So let's talk about the way that the fountain pen gets its ink, basically, and it is a water-based ink. We have a feed here, which I'll pull out of the section. This is very similar to the feed in a rollerball pen, where you'll see at the end here, there's a little channel here, and it goes all the way down the middle of this section. So ink is traveling down the middle here, and these fins basically help keep the nib flush with ink. They will hold on to excess ink and with this essentially controlled leak. And you'll notice there are 3 stages to this feed. The fins here are much tighter, and then they get a little bit looser and thicker, and then at the end they get the widest. So you're going to have the slowest flow here, it's going to get a little bit faster, and then it's going to get fastest at the end there. And the way that it sits in the nib here, something like this. So at the very end of the feed, the ink is really just touching this piece of metal, which is just a sheet of metal that is stamped and shaped into a nib here. Now there's a slit at the end here, creating 2 tines, and then at the very, very end, we have this little ball of iridium which is welded on there. Iridium is a member of the platinum family, and it is extremely hard and will not generally wear away in normal use. So that tip is welded on there, and then the slit is cut through the tip and the nib. I'm going to use this Clio Scribent Classic here. We have the ink, again, traveling through this feeder and this little slit at the end to this iridium ball. And this is not a ball that rolls inside of a metal tube. It's welded on, it is fixed, and it has to deliver this ink just by that leak, basically. So it's not the ball rolling and, pulling this ink out as the ball makes rotations as you drag it across the page. This is a fixed system here, pretty much, the tip. So it has to work at all these different angles. But where you start to run into problems is, the tines, both tines need to touch, whereas if only one touches, it's going to stop writing. With a ballpoint, it doesn't matter. You can just keep turning and it will keep writing. This, like the Fisher Space Pen or whatever, will write upside down. That was a big deal back in the day because you couldn't really do that with a fountain pen. You basically need to be having the ink come through the feed through this controlled leak process. So these pens are more finicky. The tip alignment is very important. Now, let's also talk about the expensive pen problem. My observation is that the more expensive pens, particularly the ones with gold nibs, tend to be more problematic. I think that's just the nature of the gold material. It is softer, it's easier to get out of alignment, and ultimately I think that's why there may be more issues with gold nibs. And I mean, it's more frustrating because they're more expensive. And if you're buying a gold nib fountain pen, you're expecting it to be better than a steel nib pen, which a lot of times it doesn't end up being, at least not without some kind of tuning or adjustment. So, I mean, the real question is like, should quality control at these companies be catching it? I mean, I feel like the answer is yes. Most companies, especially the high-end ones, Mont Blanc, Grafon, Faber-Castell, Aurora, Montegrappa, they're testing these pens at their factory, but it doesn't seem to always catch the last, 5% of performance that ends up mattering. To catch every bad nib, the companies would have to employ human inspection. You'd have to test with multiple different types of inks and papers, and it's really just not that viable for the company to do. And if the problem was big enough that it was affecting their business, I'm sure they would be working on ways to improve their quality control with these nibs. That's what's, kind of frustrating. You can have a luxury product and they just can't get this one thing exactly right. But so then the next question is the issue that I'm experiencing actually a defect? There's sort of three levels that we need to think about. One category is preference. You might like a really dry pen, so you're not going to be happy if you get a Pelican and it's super, super wet. The fine could write like a medium or a broad when you're used to something that's much drier, more like an Aurora. You might like a pen that is smoother versus more feedback. Again, Pelican would be very smooth. Something like Sailor or Aurora would have more feedback. And then there's softness and hardness of the nibs. That typically people don't attribute to being a problem, but there are those preferences. That's sort of the first layer. And then below that, there is the adjustment layer. The nib is essentially good. There isn't really anything wrong with the individual parts. The nib, the tip, and the feed. They're just maybe slightly out of alignment, need to be reseated, or the tines are maybe too tight, need to be moved apart a little bit. That is sort of an adjustment, not necessarily a proper defect. And that's where I think kind of a lot of nib issues tend to lie. Now then, the worst category would be the defect category. The tipping is not shaped properly. You might have baby's bottom. It may be uneven. The slit I've seen many times cut unevenly. And then something I haven't really seen with new pens, but older pens, you can have cracks in nibs. You can have sprung nibs, or the nib just doesn't write under normal pressure. These are all defect things where I do feel that like the manufacturer really should have caught that. I mean, it's not really acceptable, but these are, I would say, rarer things, whereas the adjustment is what's more common. When you have a pen that has an issue, what I recommend that you do is you let the retailer know, and this is for new pens, well, and used pens actually. If you get one and it's not writing properly, let the person you bought it from, the seller, know right away so you have that flag planted so that you have the option, depending on the policies of the retailer, to return it. They can sometimes swap the nib or just replace the pen. Or in some cases, it may need to go back to the manufacturer, in which case it may take some time. Typically, if you flag it early enough, they can offer some kind of faster resolution. And then the final option is the Nibmeister option. With the Nibmeister, they can, really tailor the pen to you. You can tell them the angle that you hold the pen, how much pressure you apply on the paper. They can really get it optimized for you. And in some cases, that may make the most sense. Typically, if I think I can get a replacement or a fix quickly from the retailer or the manufacturer, I will go that route. But if I think it's going to be harder, or it is a pen that is rare that I can't replace and I need to have it adjusted, then it'll go to a Nibmeister, which is more expensive. But I will say, when you get a new pen and you have an issue with the way that it's writing, you want to let that retailer know as soon as possible so that it can be remedied and you have the most options available. The expectation of this perfect writing pen, I really think, comes from us being used to mainly ballpoint and gel pens, which are pretty much foolproof. Really isn't too much adjustment that can be done to them. It either works or it doesn't, and that's just not the way that a fountain pen is. And when I try to think of other products that are like this, there isn't any exact parallel, but like, you can think of a guitar, for instance. It's common when you buy a new guitar that you pay a little bit extra money to tune and set up the guitar for you. There's also issues where, humidity changes and you need to adjust the guitar. Same thing with a piano. These are fine instruments, including a fountain pen. I think it makes sense to think about fountain pens in that way. When we think historically, a lot of times people will say, oh, the fountain pens in the past, they were made so much better than they are today. I think that's true to an extent, but I also think that the stuff that we're getting today is better than the old pens in a lot of ways. We have better manufacturing technologies. We have more advanced material science. We're not dealing with cork and sacks and stuff that's going to dry out, just naturally. You could say that the nibs maybe were better. They certainly were more flexible. But, if you're looking at a pen from the 1950s, today, that is an enormous filter of 75 years. So the bad pens, they didn't survive, right? If it was a pen that didn't work, it's not going to survive 75 years, 100 years. It's going to be thrown in the bin at some point. So when we think of vintage pens being better than new ones, just be aware that there's a massive filter on there. There might be some truth to it, but I always think of the 101 Dalmatians movie where the villain, Cruella de Vil, I think her name is furiously shaking her fountain pen because she cannot get it to write and ink is shooting everywhere. This is a very wealthy woman that would have had a very expensive fountain pen. So I think it's a mistake to assume that all fountain pens in the past were so much better than the fountain pens of today. But that's pretty much it. Those are sort of my thoughts on this sort of common problem of getting a brand new pen and just not having it be perfect. I think we need to adjust our expectations, but also, make sure we're proactive if we have a problem, that we don't just let it go and just say, oh, that's just the way it is. We want to not have this issue. It might be just the nature of it to some extent, but I think having better fountain pen quality control would be a really nice thing to have. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time.